I'm going to be using the projector, and it's as much for me as it is for you. So it doesn't make sense at times. Sorry, but hopefully it will help me keep my thoughts together as I go through some of this. And I will say that there's already a lot of overlap with what she started with, and then from previous sessions of this. In particular, as it relates to, as the first question posed, is do facts even matter? We certainly have, the first presenters, Dr. Hill and Dr. Arians, and Kelly too. Oh, it's on. I think it's on, but it's not moving. Oh, I did. Okay. So I learned a lot from Monday's presentation, for instance, learning from Callie, for instance, learning with algorithms and so forth. There's all these things about the facts that are presented. And while these, the things that we're learning about the institutional and the political processes associated with democracy, they're relevant, and how we receive this information, whether it's on Facebook or whether we understand it from the library and everything else. I'm going to argue that maybe those facts that exist don't hit people in the same way. In fact, it's the socio-emotional needs that largely determine what we're going to believe in the first place. It doesn't really matter what facts are out there at all. So in general, this will be kind of the premise, is that I question the acquisition of facts, whether that sufficiently explains the differences in worldviews that kind of divide us right now. It's not just what information is available. It's how we take them in. I'm going to probably steal from, I don't know, maybe Brian will talk about, Brian and Dr. Powell's on Friday from the psychological perspective, but a concept that really stood out to me is motivational reasoning. And I will say that there are certainly people who could just not lack information and they're duped because of it. They don't know enough because they're not getting the right information. The main argument that I'm going to more or less present is, what people want to be duped to a certain extent. They want to hear things that confirm sort of their own ideas. And so just even if we have better way in which we communicate these ideas, the more ideas are out in the forum, in public forum, in space, it doesn't mean everyone's going to want to hear it. In fact, they're just going to go find their echo chambers regardless even if there's an algorithm that shifts that way. Not to suggest that those algorithms don't matter, they certainly do. Okay, so one of the things that I was just, I recently heard an interview with a journalist named Kelly Wheel. She was basically describing the reasons why people participate in the flat Earth conspiracy movements, essentially. So I'm going to use this as an example because it sort of really speaks to the idea that facts really are secondary. When I was listening to this, it was just an interview podcast and just basically describing what you learn. I was all I want to know is what's their argument? It doesn't make any sense. All you have to do is get in a boat and just sail around the world and it will complete all the facts will go right away. All of their presumptions that it might have. It's an absurd idea, right? And why aren't you talking about that? Why aren't you talking about that? Eventually she did. And basically we live in a snow globe. That's the argument that some people suggest. It's not her idea, by the way. She doesn't believe in these things. But the argument that she makes is that there's some people who tend to be more susceptible to believing these things. So the flat Earth, the idea that the world's flat, it doesn't make sense, but some people are going to want to follow these conspiracies because they provide emotional comfort, which doesn't seem to make sense, but we have a physicist here, we have other folks here, we can think about the expanse of the universe and how incomprehensible it is to our brains. It's very disconcerting to people. They do not like the ambiguity of being a speck of dust on a speck of dust of Earth and thinking that we're important or have meaning. That is really awful to think about. And I'm going to connect that with their social experiences in other ways in terms of why we might be drawn to other types of misinformation. Anyways, this is one argument that was made, but just like on the show notes, Kelly Whale says that when humans are confronted with a complex and up and inscrutable world, it's natural that many seek simple answers, such as that the earth is flat, surrounded by an ice wall, and safely capped off by a roof upon which outer space is depicted. There's some comfort in that. It's, you feel like you're important. So simple solutions to complex problems. That is more or less one of the arguments that is made for why people are drawn to things like authoritarianism and fascism. Because the truth doesn't always set us free. In fact, the opposite sometimes happens. The truth makes us feel uncomfortable. So we're looking for people and things that set things, in order for us. So anyway, I'll get into like some of the sociological things that might draw us to certain types of anti-democratic, or drive us towards these things. I'm going to rely on a mid-century, 20th century theorist named Erich Fromm. He was a social psychologist who was a Jew that escaped the Nazis prior to World War II. And so as a social psychologist, he was sort of obsessed with what drove fascism, what drove the appeal of Hitler when it seems, otherwise absurd. Anyway, so he spoke to the sort of, I'll say mental illness. It's not necessarily something you see in a psychological textbook, but just the way in which we emotionally struggle with modern society. We can easily draw upon, Fromm draws upon any number of social theorists out there who depict the ways in which we kind of experience a series of crises, especially when there's social progress. So when we think about, I think the improvements that come with feminism, there's also a backlash to it. There's a crisis of masculinity that might emerge, for example, or when there's progress in the form of, racial equality, there's a crisis in the racial hierarchy and the social order there that people feel very disconcerted by, for instance. Or maybe the loss of religion and its relevance in society. There's a draw to something that makes you feel comfortable, for instance. In general, we're talking about this drive towards something. Maybe it's modernity. I'm going to talk about postmodernity in the next slide a little bit more. But the traditional order is being interrupted. Now, a lot of people are like, I'm on board with science. Like, I'm on board with vaccines. That's great for me. But it opens the door for all sorts of conspiracies that people are kind of, that would maybe comfort people, for instance. Or I'm all for, personally, racial equality, but for some people, that means maybe I don't have as much power anymore. I'll talk more about that. So there are these traditional ways that we, maybe have a sense of order and purpose and meaning that in some ways might be regressive to us. There are certainly people who aren't benefiting from, let's say, the inequality that might exist, I don't know, in a monarchy, but we hold on to it because at least I know who's in charge. And when that disintegrates, it could be anarchy for a lot of people. Some people hate it, even though a lot of us are like, yes, of course I want these improvements. And so the word that I use that's based on a very important sociologist that almost every sociologist uses all the time is this word called anomie. It's this feeling, the sense of normlessness that is created by this disruption of this social order. We feel it, it's built on a collective level, and then there's a response to it. Okay, I'm going to read this. You don't have to read all of it. It's one of those things where I just need it for myself. But this is a really interesting point that Fromm wrote about in his text, Sane Society. And it speaks very much to democracy. The average voter is poorly informed. It's gender from the 20th century. While he reads his newspaper regularly, the whole world is so alienated from him that nothing makes real sense or carries real meaning. He reads of billions of dollars being spent, of millions of people being killed, figures, abstractions, which are in no way interpreted into concrete, meaningful picture of the world. The science fiction he reads and many lists of memory items, are a little different from the science news. Everything is unreal, unlimited, impersonal. Facts are so many lists of memory items, like puzzles in a game, not elements in which his life and that of his being, in spite of these conditions. Reading this English hard. And that of his children depends. It is indeed a sign of resilience. In other words, it's amazing that we do figure things out. We do have any institutions that are held together, given the chaos. And basic sanity of the average human being, that in spite of these conditions, political choices today are not entirely irrational. It's amazing that there's any semblance of order. And to continue, this is on democracy. If democracy means that the individual expresses his conviction and asserts his will, the premise is that he has a conviction and that he has a will. And this speaks very much to what Callie was describing. The facts, however, are that the modern alienated individual has opinions and prejudice, and also Amanda, but no convictions, has likes and dislikes, but no will. His opinions and prejudices, likes and dislikes, are manipulated in the same ways as taste is by powerful propaganda machines. This is well before Facebook, which might not be effective were you not already conditioned to such influences by advertising and by his whole alienated way of life. And that last sentence is kind of sort of referring to in this general sense of enemy that people are experiencing. So one way in which we understand enemy and deal with enemy is, reconcile these feelings is explained by one theorist, this general stream theory. And the notion behind the general stream theory is that when we don't have, let's read this. When people use socially unacceptable, which is very normative, means to acceptable ends, we will do other things to get to those acceptable ends. So if we want social order, we might have a backlash. We might go back. We might resort to other means to get what we want. So in general, it's fair to say that people like and deserve, let's say, a sense of control over their lives, security, purpose, meaning, social status. That's really important. We think about like social ranking. They want to feel important. And we want to cure this sense of enemy where people don't like this idea of this rapidly changing society and they're not in power. So if democracy doesn't offer these things to certain people, this chaos in the world, you might find other socially unacceptable things to meet those ends, for instance. And this is maybe where we might enter in the word fascism. So I'll just define it here and I'll get into it a little bit more on the next slide, but fascism, this is what Fromm was discussing in the middle of the 20th century as it relates to this movement, political movement, that exalts nation and race. This is your in-group, more or less, above the individual, and that there is a, let's say, autocratic government, or not, like authoritarian. And in addition, there is the use of force to get your way. Start thinking like a bully on a playground, for instance. It's like, bully on the playground, they're not like the smartest people, they just are the strongest, and they're just going to push people around until they get what they want. And, okay. Anyways, so what fascism offers is simplicity. You don't have to be smart. You don't need facts. It doesn't take any intellectual effort. All you need is power for the restoration of power. As long as you're on the in-group, you don't care what happens to other people because you're protected. Your place in the social order is the only thing that matters. And in general, force trumps reason. Just a minute here more. So what about fascism is so appealing psychologically, given the enemy that we're experiencing? Who would prefer violence, lies, and authoritarianism over democracy, rule of law, forbearance, and mutual toleration? Thanks, Tim, for those concepts on Monday. Lots of people, lots of people. When democracy is perceived as a zero-sum game heightened by propaganda, I'm describing, when your people will lose significant power, perceived or real, an authoritarian who steps in to restore your power is extremely appealing. Like, who cares if it's democratic? If I'm on the bottom of things, then I want someone to restore it for me. Democracy is completely outdated from your point of view. So when an authoritarian will put your people back on top where they belong, democracy is a very unappealing alternative. And just on a point, Carol Anderson speaks to this too. Democracy in this country is actually really only existed since the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, because that's when everyone else got to vote. So in some respects, because people are now being included in the political process, this is why you see the backlash now. Now, granted, we could see backflashes to the Civil War, the end of our type of Civil Rights Act, the end of Jim Crow, but those are time periods when you see these backflashes because the racial order or the other order that we've become used to is being threatened. So in sum, I would argue that truth matters, but is secondary sometimes to the socio-emotional experience of people. And I'm not advocating for the progression of social progress from the thing I've been talking about. And we can't just mollify reactionary politics, because backlash is inevitable. We still have to move forward, but perhaps the best we can do, and this is where it's really hard, is bolster our social institutions, the education, very much what Callie was describing, our voting institutions, legal, economic, community, all of these things in preparation for the backlash, just to be a bulwark against those things. All right, sorry I went over time, but now I am done. Thank you.